So next fall, assuming the chair agrees, I'm going to teach a philosophy course, sort of, which will be called Philosophy on Rails. And the idea behind this course is that philosophy, for too long, has lacked the equivalent of the international system of units. What that means is that philosophers argue too much about the meanings of basic terms. Already more than 150 years ago, they agreed on the basic units, and gradually as new units of measure have been added, they agree on the definitions of these non-basic units in terms of the basic units. Now, philosophers have never agreed on anything. And so this means that philosophers spend a lot of their time arguing about the meanings of the basic terms that philosophers employ when doing their work. And what happens is that they solve a problem, if they're very lucky, and so philosophers go around in circles. And one of the reasons why I stopped being a philosopher is because I found myself attending meetings at which the very same theses were being defended as new discoveries that I had heard 20 years ago by equally naive philosophers who were working on related topics. And I became angry because I was working in a field which was desolate. People were going around in circles. So nobody notices because there's no way of expressing results in philosophy in a terminology that everyone shares, or that everyone is willing to allow their results to be expressed in. So what I want to create is a terminology for describing philosophical ideas, philosophical theories, philosophical results that will be able to be used as a repository of philosophical achievements, philosophical discoveries that will be such that everyone can use that repository to check that they're not going around in circles, that they're not doing redundant work because the work has already been done. Now, I already know what the basis of this repository will be. The goal is for all results in philosophy to be capturable by this philosophical counterpart of the international system of units. Now, there are two possibilities. If you find a philosophical result that can't be captured in the system I will be proposing, one option is that the philosophy is wacko nonsense. It's really bad. That we can't express these using the international system that I will be proposing, then that's not a problem for the international system. It's a problem for the philosophy in question. On the other hand, there may be obviously important philosophical results of even whole disciplines of philosophy that can't be captured using this system, and that would be a problem for the system. The system would have to be extended in order to provide the resources for describing the results in that discipline. Now, I confess immediately that I do not yet know how to use this system to describe anything that has to do with ethics. So the system is always being examined, and attempts to extend it to cover new areas are ongoing at any given time. And we are trying to work out how to capture the basis of ethics in a way that would allow ethical results to be described using this system. Now, I'm not proposing that all philosophers should speak using this proposed system. That would be good, of course, but people can go on doing what they're doing, and other people then would have the job of capturing the results of what they do using this system. And the system would be, for instance, a very useful extension of the Phil Papers category system, which is, for all kinds of reasons, rather bad. The main reason from our present purposes is that you can't use it to check for redundant quasi-discoveries, because there's no consistent way of describing the results that people achieve using the system of categories that you find in Phil Papers. I assume everyone knows what Phil Papers is. It's the nearest thing that we have to a starting point for the kind of work I'm here describing. Now, of course, in the Middle Ages, pretty much everyone used a reasonably good basic system, and they used reasonably good basic terms that they all more or less shared, and so they could have really good arguments without wasting too much time defining the meanings of terms. And various attempts have been made more recently to work on a category system which would be similar to the category system proposed by Aristotle. So if we were all Aristotelians, it would be very easy to create the basic framework for describing all philosophical results, because the terminology would be shared. And these are, I think, fairly reasonable proposals. They're only starting points. They don't go quite far enough. And especially not the last one, of course. All right, so the very word ontology, which is what we're going to be trying to do now, came from the Latin translation ontologia of metaphysics. So they had to find a word that would correspond to Aristotle's metaphysics. And Aristotle has a system of categories which describes everything in the universe into two different sorts or categories, as he would say, namely substance on the one hand, which are organisms and things like that, and then accidents on the other hand, which are of types listed here. And this is a presentation of the whole theory of Aristotle in regard to the two main categories of substance and accident, which divides the accidents into occurrent accidents and continuant accidents. Substances are continuants. That means they continue to exist through time. And 4 of the accidents are continuants, and 3 of them are on the occurrence side, let's say. Ludger Jansen formulated Aristotle's categories in terms of this opposition between occurrence and continuance. That's not typically what you do with Aristotle, but I think it's a very illuminating way of explaining what Aristotle is getting at. This is more like the way it's usually done. This was Brentano's presentation of the categories, so that you divide them into substances and accidents, basically, and you don't recognize the distinction between those accidents which correspond to occurrence, which are things like processes or events, and those accidents which are continuants. Interestingly, there's no room for powers here, but that's Aristotle's problem. Now, Chisholm does something different, and again, I think this is a very good starting point, but it's not the starting point that I want to propose, partly because he clumsily uses the same word for 2 quite different categories. All right, now most attempts to do the kind of work that I've been describing in the 20th century start out with the ontology built into first-order predicate logic. So this was obviously a good idea. First-order predicate logic is a really valuable language for capturing the content of propositions and capturing the relations between propositions. And so the ideal of the Vienna Circle, for instance, was to capture the whole of science, using just axioms of first-order predicate logic, and then one could prove that the whole of science was consistent, or we could find inconsistencies in the whole of science. And if the whole of science can be captured using just sentences of these 2 forms, F holds of A and R holds of A, comma B, or A, comma B, comma C, and so forth, then that would be a very good piece of evidence that the whole of reality is organized in such a way that there are 2 or 3 kinds of entities, namely big F entities and little a, b, c entities, and maybe also big R entities. So this is something like the idea I'm propounding, except I think that Fantology is a huge simplification. It's not just big F's and little a's. There's more going on in reality. But there were great philosophical Fantologists, including Wittgenstein and Russell, and also Armstrong. So this is Armstrong's spreadsheet ontology. You put all the predicates along the top, and you put all the particular individuals along the side, and then you can give a map of the entire universe. And of course he made it a little bit more interesting by having relations and by having the individuals and the universals combined together in states of affairs. But still, of course, the big problem with this is that it doesn't work for any of the predicates that we use in ordinary language or even in scientific language, and it doesn't work either for any of the common names that we use for the particulars in reality. It only works, says Armstrong, for the future perfected science. Future perfected science will issue in a picture of reality like this. Now, I am not interested in future perfected science, but in any case, I'm not interested in the kind of reductionism which future perfected science presupposes. Future perfected science, the idea says, only future perfected science captures reality because that's the only reality there is, namely the Fantologist's reality. And the reality that we presuppose when we use natural language, or indeed scientific language, doesn't exist. It's just a logical construction based upon future perfected science. I'm proposing to create a framework or a vocabulary for tagging the results of philosophers doing their ordinary work in such a way that using that framework and the tagged data about philosophical discoveries, we can work out which philosophical discoveries are genuine and which are plagiarism or just redundant reinventing of the wheel. That's the goal. Everyone believes that there are individuals, pretty much, even Spinoza. But people have different views as to what the F's are. And some think they're just sets of A's. And some think that there are no F's. And of course we can capture those kinds of differences very easily. So this is the Armstrong spreadsheet ontology. There are universals and there are particulars. And particulars are always substances. He's not actually very clear about that because it's future perfected science which will decide. But it could be that they are events or something. But let's assume, I think it's probably true that particulars are going to be particulars whatever happens. And then there are universals which he calls properties. And then sometimes, I'm assuming he's going to have to accept relations. So this is the generic Fantology view. And this is Quine. So Quine accepts individuals, but he's not sure about predicates, properties, attributes, because they don't fall within the domain of quantification in classical first-order predicate logic. Now, I don't find that a very good argument because we can, of course, just add little a letters to refer to the properties. If the properties exist, there's no reason why we have to always use them in the names for them in the predicate position. We could use the names for properties also in the argument position, and which is what I actually recommend, which is what we end up doing. But anyway, Quine thought that it was a good argument that, from the fact that we do not quantify over properties in standard first order predicate logic, it follows that properties do not exist. So that this is just summarizing nominalist fantology. Now, Peter Simons, he's not the only person who embraces a position like this, but he is a nominalist, but he's a bicategorial nominalist, which means he accepts both substances and accidents, or both substances and property-like things, but the property-like things are on the individual level rather than on the universal level. So this is certainly better than monocategorial nominalism. It's a small step in the right direction. And in fact, in the end, he steps halfway back down again. He doesn't really believe in substances because substances are just trope bundles. So everything is a trope. And now this is the pièce de résistance. All good ontologists until E.J. Lowe had a view like this, I say. And good means they get close to the framework I'm going to defend. And the reason why they're good is it's very easy to apply to the framework to what they do, because indeed they have already started using something like the framework in their work, which is what everyone should do in the end, but we don't impose that at the beginning. This four-category ontology, or the Aristotelian ontological square, is based on the idea that there are two kinds of predication. You can either say that something is a man, or a ball, or a planet, or you can say that something is hungry, or red, or suntanned. And this distinction was not accepted by Frege. Frege replaced this distinction, which everyone had accepted until his day, by the distinction between function and argument. And if you take function and argument, it's the same. John is a man, well, that just means man holds of John. And if you say John is hungry, that just means hungry holds of John. And it's the same. But for everyone else, for obvious reasons, there was a distinction between those two kinds of predication. You want to say not merely that John exemplifies headache, but also that John has a headache, which is the headache we're trying to cure now with this pill. Medicine needs things in that box down there. So now we're going to move from the four-category ontology to the six-category ontology. And now going back to the discussion earlier about continuance and occurrence, if you only believe in continuance, then you are in effect a three-dimensionalist. You're saying that everything in the world evolves through time and acquires new properties, loses properties, and so forth. All of the people who had all four boxes filled in the Aristotelian ontological square are three-dimensionalists. But there are events, things change. Properties hold of objects at different times. And so everyone has to work out how they're going to deal with the fact that properties hold of objects at different times. A common view is the Cambridge change view, namely that there are no changes, really. Rather, there are objects which are P at time t, and those objects are Q at time t prime, and that's it. And because the object is P at time t and Q at time t prime, we can see that the object has changed, but there is no change in reality. All the changes are Cambridge changes. Now, some changes are Cambridge changes, but we would normally say that they're not real. So, for instance, I am now a certain number of feet from Whitwater's Rand, and if I move carefully over the room, then I am a different number of feet from Whitwater's Rand. That is a Cambridge change. I just might change my relation to Whitwater's Rand. But that's not a real change. It's not an intrinsic change or a change which is founded in me. It's a Cambridge change. That's what a Cambridge change is. Now, some people think that the way to solve this problem, how do you deal with real changes, is to become a four-dimensionalist and to say that there is only change, or there are only processes in the universe, or there are only stages or phases. They are the ultimate constituents of reality. And we need to be able to deal with ontologies like that. Four-dimensionalism is a perfectly reasonable ontology, it's just wrong. Now, another problem with Fantology is that it doesn't deal with contexts or environments. And in fact, philosophers in the 20th century, philosophers generally indeed, including Aristotle, didn't really do a good job with environments. But powers get their oomph realized always in environments of a certain sort, in which the triggers can work. So, how do we deal with environments, and more specifically, how do we deal with spatial regions, which would be a good start? Aristotle tries to do place, but he doesn't do it very well. Basically, his theory of places works quite well for fish, but not so well for other kinds of organisms. We want to say that there are changes. A ball changes its shape. There is a change. And you have a thought. That is a process, a very important process, which we need to have in our ontology. And it's not a substance, and it's not an accident. It's not a substance, it's not a particular, it's not a property. It's something that happens. It's a very important something that happens. And we want to have those somethings that happen in our ontology, and four-dimensionalism lets you have those somethings which happen, but sacrifices the things which they happen in. So let's build an ontology which we're going to call the sixth category ontology, according to which there are three kinds of entities, namely objects, qualities, and processes, or better, objects, attributes, and processes, at the level of both universals and indices. And so we get this. There are substances, substance universals, qualities, quality universals, processes, and process universals. Now I would say attributes, because we use quality for a slightly narrower thing, but we'll come to them. All right, now there's process nominalism, which is not... Oh, it's a good position. We know where it lives. And then there are tropists, so Peter Simon smudges his way out of flux a bit. And then there's Quine again, who is obviously in a bad way. But Davidson, now he is another person who belongs to the pantheon of somewhat great but failed philosophers, who doesn't really do very well with the universals, but at least he gets events right. That was a great achievement in the world, the fantological world that he was living in. David Lewis is still a fantologist, and look where that got him. Davidson was truly heroic in just this one move. He got buttering the toast right. And then there's powers. Now, I realize I'm not doing justice to the powers metaphysic quite yet. So I understand that you do believe in objects. You just don't think that they are under the purview of the philosopher. Is that right? That's a good...
Yeah, that's fair.
So the scientists deal with the objects and the philosophers deal with their powers. Is that right?
Yeah.
So the scientists don't deal with powers?
They do. They just don't deal with the structure.
Okay, so why don't you deal with the structure of objects then? To help the science.
There's not much to say beyond that.
I see. I would think there is a bit more, but still, what do you put up here?
There are plenty of things up there. Most of the types.
Give me some.
Most of the types of
types
below that.
So you have types of objects?
Yes.
You have types of powers?
Definitely.
You have types of constellations of powers?
Definitely.
And you have types of realization, manifestations of powers?
Yes.
Good. All right.
It's only the first one.
And you check all 6 boxes, so you're in good shape. So what about blueprints? I thought they might go here, but that might be wrong.
They're not continuous, but they're not occurrence. I don't know what they are.
Aha, now things I'm getting worried.
Yeah, you should be a bit worried. They're a bit platonic. So
Oh, that's fine.
So they're kind of universal.
Yeah, if they're platonic, they fall outside my purview.
Yeah.
For the moment, anyway. But anyway. So you're a structural realist where the structures are platonic.
Yeah.
A power structure realist.
Yes.
But you are also you're a believer in universals when it comes to types of objects, types of powers, and types of manifestations.
Yes.
Are they structural universals too?
No.
Okay, good. So
they're what's in the blueprint.
So basic formal ontology. There are types, and basic formal ontology is a representation of types, but all types have instances. That's a rule. You see, we have independent continuance, which is our name for things like things, aggregates of things, and parts of things. Then we have dependent continuum, which is our name for attributes, which include quality, but also include dispositions and powers and those sorts of things. And then we have occurrence. And then we have various relations connecting all of these things. And occurrence depend on particulars. And we have rules for using BFO. We have lots of lessons learned from people who've used it. We have lots of software that people are using to manage BFO-based ontologies, all of which could be applied in one way or another to an eventual ontology of philosophy and the data that would be tagged using that ontology. And we have lots of experts on BFO. Some people think that we need an 8-category ontology because they think we need process qualities. So some processes are slow and some are quick. Now BFO can deal with process qualities without needing an extra 2 categories, and so we do. In fact, the only person I know who defends an 8-category ontology explicitly is a man called Luc Schneider, who worked for Dolce for a time, then worked for me for a time, actually.
How do you deal with them?
So let's suppose a vehicle is moving with a velocity of 8 miles per hour. Then the vehicle has a certain quality, namely the quality of moving at 8 miles per hour. And now we have disposition, so heart disease is a disposition because all diseases are dispositions, and the disposition has a disposition course. John's heart disease course is both an instance of heart disease course and it's an instance of chronic heart disease course. Why should we take BFO seriously? Why should the world philosophical, why should we take BFO as our framework for universal tagging, which is going to cost billions of dollars? The answer is because there is an organization called the International Standards Organization. There's another organization called the International Electrotechnical Commission, which have a joint technical committee which deals with information technology. The International Electrotechnical Commission, incidentally, deals with the standardization of things like plugs and sockets. They make sure that things connect. And so BFO is a connector for other ontologies. And it's now been approved. It's an international standard. It was approved in October with a unanimous vote. Standard is in two parts. The first part expresses the requirements for being a top-level ontology, and the second part is a standardized representation of BFO, showing that it satisfies the requirements of the first part. Part 1 contains useful definitions of things like ontology and domain ontology, and category, which is useful for what we're doing here, and top-level ontology. A top-level ontology should cover categories across a maximally broad range of domains, which means everything, basically. So if there are categories of mathematical entity, then the top-level ontology would have to have some way of dealing with those categories if it's going to satisfy the requirements of part 1. And there is a book describing how to build ontologies according to part 2, which is now being translated into Chinese and is in the process of being translated into Portuguese. The point of mentioning that BFO is now used by 300 different ontology groups is that this proves that BFO is useful and has been really heavily tested by very critical and very demanding people. There is no philosophical theory of categories which is even close in the degree to which it has been logically formalized. So we have, first of all, various formalizations in rather weak languages which are computable languages. And then we have a formalization of the whole of BFO in first-order logic, which has some 350 axioms. And we've proved it consistent. It's a manual proof. So we had to build our own software to support the building manually of a model in which all the axioms are verified. It's not me who did it, it's Alan Rothenberg, who sometimes is seen in this room.